Thanks to all of you for being here. And I also want to say thank you to our wonderful RAs who are here today as well. This event will not happen without them, so we really appreciate it. And you'll be seeing them all day over here. And did I forget anything? That's it, right? Okay, so we start with initial interventions. It follows more or less the same structure as the discussion yesterday. Oops. So first, we can start in whatever order you prefer. If you can tell, like, based on your experience, what are the questions being overlooked or the assumptions being made that we should think about or rethink or reimagine in this intersection of AI, technology, climate action, and environmental justice?
Sure. Hello, everybody. So yeah, I'm not actually a scholar who studies AI. Instead, I focus on like the wider picture of the environmental impacts of the ITC sector in general and how that sector tries to minimize or undo or manage its environmental burdens. And so from that perspective, I really see AI, by which I mean machine learning algorithms, more acutely generative machine learning algorithms today, as just an intensification of already existing trends. Like, there's kind of nothing new here at a very fundamental level, which is to say this is an industry based on surveillance and data scraping and privacy violations, sort of clumsy construction of very, very large data sets of very questionable ethical origin, the centralization of the industry into very few, very large players with increasing monopoly powers, and a story of the expansion of data centers of sort of like concrete and gigawatts and water. So, you know, there's also in that mix like a lot of half measures to kind of make and then break promises on how the environmental costs of that all play out. And I think AI has, again, been an intensification of already existing trends, which is to say a lot of one step forward, two steps back. To give an example, in 2020, Microsoft claimed it would be carbon negative at the end of the decade. Its emissions today are 30% higher than they were 4 years ago. Its water is up by 34%, and there's just been you know, this huge spike in data center construction, a kind of unquenchable desire to continue to grow that is the base cause of that. So, you know, there's more statistics I could throw out, but, you know, in my research, I really do focus on the worlds of the data centers themselves, the impacts those have on local power grids, local water tables, and then wider sort of like carbon target trajectories of nation states and communities that host them. And I also try to encourage people to think about how to act in solidarity with those local communities. And, you know, instead of sort of worrying about your personal carbon emissions, it might be constructive to think about how you could get into a fight with a data center, like join those struggles on the ground and think about like broader sectoral trajectories for how we can sort of prevent the continued expansion of these infrastructures. I will say when I look at the field of the arguments about AI and environmental impacts, I see a lot of both sidisms. You know, I see a lot of people meeting in rooms like this, having conversations where we will acknowledge there's good things that AI could do and bad outcomes that could also happen. And I think if the conversation ends there, we're not having a terribly constructive conversation. We're kind of, you know, making a qualitative argument. You know, there's one unit of good things, one unit of bad things, and who's to say which one is bigger? So while I'm really quite skeptical about some of the methodologies that are out there about calculating the carbon impacts of XYZ network thing, I do think that there is a lot of productive work to be done in sort of really looking at the different degrees of intensity. And, you know, if I were a betting person, if I were to you know, sort of throw a lot on the table, I would say there's probably more bad than good when we look at the overall general picture of, again, generative machine learning algorithms today. And so I think one of the key questions I'm sitting with is, how do we turn a lot of them off, right? How do we move towards a system where we're thinking more about degrowth computing, where we are trying to fight back against the hype cycles and business strategies of very well-capitalized companies trying to make maneuvers in a business environment no longer defined by zero interest rates, but by weird monopolistic bids to, you know, continue to grow, and which is to say to continue to grow data centers. So I remain a hater, and I am sort of here on the panel to maybe play that role, but I think also it's like very constructive to think about how we can push back against the inshittification of the internet and towards systems where, again, we are not dealing with monopoly powers who are building a business based on surveillance and privacy violations and boiling the oceans. So that's my intervention.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm here to join you in being a hater. I think we're very aligned in wanting to abolish the data center industrial complex. So I currently lead the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab at Data and Society, which is a research and policy nonprofit. And my team is using participatory methods, engaging with impacted communities to evaluate AI systems and their effects. And really why we're doing this is to create space for communities to refuse technologies that do not serve them, to open the door for abolition, essentially. And we also asked what technologies could be useful to communities or what they would like to see more of, instead of only naming the potential harms connected to the system. So like, what is a thing that they could use instead of this AI system that is being imposed on them? And we've recently started a number of projects that look at community-led impact assessments of AI infrastructures, including data centers, to think about human rights issues like noise pollution, air pollution, water and land use, and grid difficulties for people who live near them. And as Anne also alluded to, terms like AI and compute often obscure disparities in different forms of labor. And so what I'd really like to see happening at the level of both research and policy is the measurement and mitigation of climate impacts across the AI supply chain and across the life cycle. And it's really become way too common for tech companies to use the ambiguity of AI and the potential of machine learning to justify their growing power, and claiming that AI will help solve social issues like climate change, relying on speculative fantasy instead of looking at tangible existing harms. And I also have a bit of experience working with the green software movement, really tracking, activist developers within large tech companies and in climate startups who are really concerned about the energy consumption, the carbon emissions, water use attached to the technologies that they are building. And so the idea is that through things like telemetry, if you have data visualization, maybe you'll be able to help developers make better decisions, which I think is a good thing, but also it does turn it again into this individual problem and often ignores the real working conditions of developers and labs. So, how much control do they actually have? And then there's also the question beyond sort of the training of AI systems, looking at use. And so recently, a couple of very prominent sustainability workers at Microsoft quit their jobs because of Microsoft's role in not only expanding its data center infrastructures and power, to use power in many ways, but also Microsoft's partnership with oil and gas companies. And so the idea that AI could be used to drill even more oil is really quite alarming. And I think we've reached a point where developers are much more open to the idea of refusal and abolition. And so I hope that we just see more movements like No Tech for Apartheid, and and also similar movements in the climate justice space within tech. I think I'll just end by saying that the other problem with the focus on the carbon emissions alone of AI is that it does tend to also kind of separate labor-related impacts and thinking about the toxicity, say, of electronics manufacturing and other hidden, to some, labor issues across the entire supply chain or the mining industry. And so this is why I think we really need a much more comprehensive way of actively measuring and mitigating harms beyond, like a simple checklist or policy framework, which is the kind of thing that, unfortunately, we kind of end up largely doing.
Thank you to Excuse me, thank you to Jess and the whole team here at UVA for making this conversation possible and having us all here. I've been enjoying all of this hate on the panel so far, and I think I might sound kind of a lighter note of hate in my intervention. I'm a grant maker, I'm not an academic. I've been funding open source projects for about 8 years now at Mozilla. And I currently run something called the Mozilla Technology Fund. We make grants to open source maintainers. We have an interest in sustainability, so we try to fund the sorts of things that others might not fund and help them kind of cross the valley of death from interesting project, has some community engagement to the point of being sustainable. So we have funding themes that guide our investments. We have different themes every year, every 2 years. And for this past year, our theme has been climate change, environmental justice, and AI. We really tried to come into this space by asking interesting questions. We wanted to avoid techno-utopianism or techno-solutionism. We really did not want to fund anything that had the perspective of like AI is going to solve climate change, for instance. So there were kind of two main questions we were really interested in, and we were looking for projects that could help us kind of explore answers to those questions. So the first one is about tooling and measurement. What kind of open source tools exist or could be created that could be used to measure the environmental impact of AI systems? One of the things that we know that some of these big companies will do to obfuscate the environmental impact of their technologies is to have these kind of bespoke benchmarks for measuring things. And so Google will have one, Meta will have one, all of these different companies will have their own benchmark, and so it becomes really hard to kind of compare apples to apples. So we wanted to see if open source could maybe be a way of creating universal benchmarks that could help give a real point of comparison. And then the second question was, are there ways that AI could be used constructively for measuring environmental impact or assessing environmental impact? And really with an eye toward communities, are there systems that could provide data and information to communities that could help them push back against extractive uses of their land, that could help people push back against the creation of a data center, for example? These kinds of things are the ways that the technology actually could be useful. So we funded 10 projects over this past year. Our projects kind of work together in a cohort, and they provide each other with kind of peer mentorship and peer accountability. I'll talk about a couple of the projects because that's what I really am excited to talk about and really excited to share with you all. And I'm happy to kind of share more after this if there's other projects that folks want to talk about. In the first category, we have a project called Code Carbon, which is really just like a very simple developer utility for measuring the carbon footprint of a piece of code as it runs. Carbon is not the end-all be-all of climate change, as we all know, but it's a useful measurement. It's one that is easy for people to kind of wrap their head around. They have some cool things in their tooling. For example, you can put compute region in there and it will show you kind of the trade-offs for running in different compute regions and things like that. And that's it's very quickly becoming not a standard necessarily, but it's becoming pretty widely used, and it's an open source tool that has a lot of energy and excitement behind it. It has a good community and those sorts of things. So we thought that was, that's an interesting type of tool for us to see. Could we give it a little bit of rocket fuel and kind of help it become something like a de facto standard? And there's another tool called Zeus, which is looking more kind of at hardware and kind of the types of hardware you might put in data warehouses and those types of things, but very similar kind of idea, measuring the impact and trade-offs of different types of hardware that you might use to build out a data center. On the second side, there's a bunch of really interesting tools that we funded that are using AI to look at different environmental and climate change problems and to see if AI could be a tool to help kind of quickly provide environmental impact assessments. So we have a lot of folks who are using things like satellite data to look at illegal mining in the Amazon rainforest. We have a tool that is looking at illegal sand mining, which is honestly an environmental problem that I knew very little about before I started learning about this project. There's a group that is working in a local community in Kenya, a coastal community, where there's a proposal to build a nuclear reactor. And the community had wanted an environmental impact study to be conducted, and they were told it was too expensive and it was not going to be done. And so what this team has done is they have paid divers to go into the ocean and film hours and hours of footage off the coast of where this proposed site is for the nuclear reactor. And then they're using computer vision to very quickly identify all of the different species that exist there. Then they can map that to, how will these different species be impacted if the temperature of the water goes up, if certain pollutants are in the water, et cetera, et cetera. So to very quickly kind of turn around a really rich environmental impact study that wouldn't have been done otherwise. So that's a project I'm really excited about. The last one I'm going to talk about, it's a project called Methane Mapper. Methane is a kind of like underappreciated gas in terms of its impact on climate change and its impact on human health and the health of animals and ecosystems. And There's a huge problem with illegal methane emissions kind of all over the world, including in the United States, and it's something that is not kind of regulated tightly enough. So this project used publicly available satellite data to kind of identify the signature of methane emissions and to kind of calculate the rate of methane kind of coming out of a place where it's being emitted. And he kind of mapped that in a few different places, and he was looking at the United States at certain places where he kind of found hotspots, and really, did a great job building out that tooling, so it was very effective. The thing he did next, I was really impressed by and kind of surprised by, honestly. I was not expecting him to get this far, but he looked at the data and he found a cluster in East Texas of wells and things like that where there were huge amounts of illegal methane emissions. And he got on a plane and he went out there and he just went door to door and knocked on people's doors of people who lived close to these illegal methane emissions and just asked them how it had impacted their lives. And the stuff he learned was honestly mind-blowing. There was a home that he went to close to one of these methane emission sites, and they said, we've had a miscarriage in our family, our horses died, we have all of these health impacts. We can't sell our house because nobody wants to buy this land because it's so close to this site. So this family had filed 64 complaints with the state of Texas and had not heard anything back. So this is the kind of thing to me where it's like he built out the tooling, he got the data. Now he's gone and actually done the legwork in the community to get these actual stories and kind of testimonies for folks. And this is it's a class action lawsuit waiting to happen. It's a New York Times article waiting to happen. There's so much that could happen because he kind of took that project from the idea stage all the way through where the data trail led him. So those are the kinds of things I'm really excited about. I think we tried our best to kind of fund projects that we thought could provide interesting answers to those questions that we were looking at.
All right. Are we able to ask Damien to chime in?
Yes. Thank you. And yes, there's a number of assumptions that I find get kind of bundled into thinking about what artificial intelligence does and is, but also in terms of whether we should even be using it and how. These questions, these assumptions, I tend to find are in the space of things like, that it will be necessarily good for something, that it will be useful, that it will solve some problem without ever necessarily defining exactly what that problem is, without ever defining what it will be useful towards. And oftentimes we see that there are these pushes towards questions of efficiency and ease of work, and many different types of tasks being taken off our hands without the question of, okay, but does it actually do that ever being really addressed? And so we find often that many cases where artificial intelligence is assumed that it's going to make things better in some way, shape, or form, and that we just have to keep pushing. We just have to keep building. We just have to keep moving towards the next model of it. And that then eventually it will turn into the version that will solve the problems that it, in many cases, has helped to create. And when it comes to this kind of broader question of, artificial intelligence and environmental justice, sure, we've talked a lot about this and it's come up quite a bit, but you think about where the water usage shows up, the water footprint and the energy usage shows up when we build data centers that support AI. They show up oftentimes in communities that are already resource scarce. And the harms that get done by pulling water from these communities are borne necessarily unequally by the people who can least afford to bear those harms, right? And so the question that, what are we doing this for? Who is it meant to help? Who is it meant to benefit? Is kind of just glossed over in this idea that eventually, somehow, it will help everyone and it will meet the needs of the people that it has, in many cases, disproportionately harmed or outsizedly sidelined in these cases. And so when I think about these things and when I talk to my students about it, especially, I try to highlight the things that they oftentimes aren't necessarily confronted with. Thinking about, what does the energy footprint of a data center look like? What does it take to run servers that do these computations? How much are we using in terms of resources, water, fossil fuels? What's the carbon emissions? And the more that they dig down on that, oftentimes I find the more that the students, especially when they are starting out thinking about these questions, the more they actually really confront the question of, okay, so how could we do this differently? What would it take to build this in a different way? And what do we want this to be for? And so that, at the very least, encourages me to hear when I see it in my students, is that they do ask those further questions.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our speakers for launching what I'm hoping is going to be a really fascinating conversation. It's funny because the next question we had queued up is one that I think I'm going to have to adjust a bit, because we were specifically interested in talking about policy, being that we are at the Karsh Institute. But I'm hearing a lot of frustration with policy. And yet, we do have to recognize that policy gets made and that we have to work within the frames of policy. So my question to you is that, recognizing that the policies we have and the policies that are being developed right now promote certain solutions and by definition overlook others, what do you find are the things that are being promoted or overlooked that most frustrate your desires for these alternative spaces of solution making and solution finding? Where is policy helping you, reach those goals? Where is policy frustrating your efforts? And what policies might you want to see that don't attempt to solve the problem but support other ways of finding solutions? In no particular order.
Yeah, I'll jump on the policy train. So to kind of reframe maybe my hate on policy earlier, I do think policy is completely essential. So, the EU AI Act and other, even like the AI Environmental Impact Act that was passed by Ed Markey's office. These are things that are not necessarily, fully tangible yet, and particularly, the US-based environmental policy is, still very much up in the air, but it does open the door for new kinds of conversations, and it does create incentive for new kinds of research. So, why do Jess, along with Mar Hicks and I, have a NSF grant to specifically look at the environmental impacts of AI? Well, because part of the justification in writing the proposal for that is hey, there's pending legislation that will mandate this. And the entire impetus for the lab that I run is based on, the executive order around AI and also other, especially, European-based AI policy that is starting to come to fruition. So mandating things like stakeholder engagement. These are realities that companies and other organizations are now having to negotiate. And then the question is how do you actually do that work? So, you can come up with a framework and say that you need to consult stakeholders before a technology can be deployed. But, what does that mean? What does that actually look like in practice? Who is doing that work and who is paying for it? So those have been the questions that are plaguing my lab. As we are essentially, volunteer, social science researchers who are kind of doing this work for companies for free, because that's the only way you can figure out how to do it. And it's often the only way that we can get access is essentially by convincing them that we have some sort of value to add through our empirical findings. So I think it's just very, very tricky when you're trying to bridge the gap between policy recommendations and what things look like on the ground.
I'll just build on that with maybe more of a transnational sort of dimension to it, because in tracking where data centers get built and how they move around, it's a grim picture that looks a lot like fossil fuel development itself. So we know that if there's one community with a lot of activists in it that successfully, kill a plan to build a data center, that data center is probably going to get built in the community over. That's less organized, less resourced, and maybe has more favorable regulators to industry's end. So there's this sort of necessary kind of international solidaristic wend to the way that these struggles tend to go. And I think if we look at like the development of pipelines, we can see some interesting analogies there too. So there's a policy dimension to be played with it, but that policy is often downstream of social movement mobilizations. And those mobilizations usually begin with like people with problems in their backyard or their fence lines, right? Like understandably upset about this and sort of networking together the information, but also the forms of activism they need to win changes. That sometimes looks like getting really good at understanding local environmental impact statements and like consultation processes and kind of skilling up your civic 101. Sometimes it also looks like direct actions and, laying down in front of tractors. Maybe if we think about the future of climate politics, if Andreas Malm is right, maybe we're blowing up data centers in the future. I don't know. But I think, as these local movements develop these skills and find out the tactics that work to prevent things, the trick is to kind of help network those skills across different communities and across different countries. Because we know that these increasingly small companies with increasingly large amounts of capital are international in scope and are quite capable of building compute in any corner of the world that may appeal. And the costs of doing so are often not terribly different. So it's a big, big challenge, but it's one that has precedence, and that's what gives me a little bit of optimism.
So I think the thing I'm really interested in is what are the inputs we can provide into policy processes that can kind of nudge these things in the right direction, and what are some inputs we can provide that maybe wouldn't exist otherwise. So for instance, for the legislation that Senator Markey's office was working on, we try to have some of our projects provide some feedback on that legislation because they're independent practitioners. They're measuring this stuff. They have thoughts and ideas about what are the kinds of levers that you could pull in terms of stuff that you can actually measure, that's universal, that there are actually good benchmarks for, that you could start to think about as a piece of legislation. And so I think those are kinds of valuable things to help lift up those kind of small independent projects and connect them to some of those opportunities. Most of these open source developers are not paying attention to what's going on the Hill in the United States most of the time, right? So kind of connecting those dots and showing them that there's opportunities there. And in a lot of cases, the policymakers are very keen to hear from these kinds of folks. It's easy for them to find the voices from the biggest tech companies. It's harder for them to connect with these smaller kind of open source developers and maintainers who are really, working in the field at a much kind of smaller scale. I think also, about that family in East Texas that had filed the 64 complaints with the legislator or with the regulator there, and they don't have very much leverage with the regulator, right? But something that we can give them through the project that we funded is all of this data that shows, X kg per hour of methane being released into the air, which is like clearly in violation of the environmental restrictions of the state of Texas, kind of giving a little bit of weight and a little bit of leverage to some of these folks who may not have it otherwise. And then you start to think about, okay, well, could you build a class action around that? What are other ways you could kind of put pressure on the legislator to actually do their job? I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. And so kind of having the data and being able to kind of demonstrate the harm in a quantitative way, I think can be a really powerful thing, and it can help kind of fill in some of those gaps.
I want to leave space for Damien to contribute thoughts on policy.
Yeah, thank you. And mostly my thoughts echo and follow on with the thoughts that have already been shared in a number of ways. In this space, I do feel there are models that can be kind of drawn on as well. One of the things, in addition to reaching out to lawmakers and policymakers, the groups that I've been working with at UNC Charlotte and elsewhere that we've had success with, is engaging with open comment periods and engaging the community in awareness of open comment periods and using those as opportunities to explain what's at stake in new regulations that are being proposed and having community conversations around what might be happening and what would the implications be if we did follow certain regulations down certain paths, giving people the opportunity to really engage and say, what do you need? What does your community need? What do you, as somebody who's going to be subject to these technologies, what do you want to see and how do you want to see them regulated? That kind of direct community partnership and engagement has been really fruitful and is something that we're trying to encourage more of in our partners. Again, like has been said, the reaching out to places where this work is being done and doing it on a kind of a volunteer basis is definitely one of the things that we do find ourselves having to do. But once that value has been demonstrated, we've also seen them reaching back out to us and asking us for help and asking to make connections with the community. And so they are not the ones who are completely capturing the conversation. They are engaged in the conversation at that point and making it so that the kind of discussions that we have are focused on the affected community members more often, that they're centered there, and that they're not just seen as outreach targets or even just abstractly stakeholders, but as partners in what needs to be done in order to move us forward. And I think that kind of work can do a lot to get the various communities understanding what is at stake and what these different types of policies might look like in their implications.
So I'm going to introduce the last question for this portion before we move on to the Q&A. And it's to do with the theme of the whole talk. And I'm going to ask that we leave Damien up so that Damien can have the first word on this one. So warning you, Damien. So we're trying to reimagine how we could approach AI for environmental justice. But rather than asking you all to reimagine the whole system, like recognizing that these are complex systems, what is one part of these systems, policy, community engagement, the tech itself, one part of it that you would want to reimagine from the ground up, and how would you reshape it?
First and foremost, energy sourcing. The tools that are used to power these systems. One of the things that I've been working to get our community partners to think about is different ways of using renewables and sustainable energy to actually power these tools. And there's been a lot of discussion about the use of small-scale nuclear reactors by teams like Google and OpenAI, but I mean more in the face of thinking just in terms of building out capacity for wind and solar and battery repositories and using those instead of the vast extractive fossil fuels that we have been seeing as the primary source of energy. I want that to be the main shift that I would see first and foremost, because the impact that they are having by their use is massive and drastically outsized for, again, the actual use that these technologies can be meaningfully put to from more than a small fraction.
Thank you.
So if you made me a dictator king of the world for like a second, I would ask for there to be a global moratorium on data centers for like 10 years. Like the thought experiment is, what if we already have enough data centers? What if we don't need to build more? We just need to use the compute resources we already have to do better things, and to have a cap, hopefully, on the maximum amount of compute that we have as a global community to use. And therefore, we need to move away from an orientation where we can continue to grow indefinitely so long as we're making some efficiency improvements along the way, because we've seen that strategy fail. So I would just love to see all the servers in the world stand where they are alone for 10 years. I think that would have a huge impact in our global relation to technology, and hopefully some downstream benefits in all of the environmental justice concerns and social impacts and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I like both of your solutions. I'm kind of maybe still stuck in policy a little bit in my head now, and I keep thinking about the ways in which evaluations of models tend to totally leave out environmental impacts. And so I've been part of numerous conversations, including the lovely organization that Mona Sloan put together for National Academies and NIST, looking at basically ways of looking at human and organizational factors when it comes to risk management of AI. And I would say, even though we had a couple of conversations here and there about the environmental impacts of AI, it would be kind of picked up and then dropped immediately. And we would go back to talking about AI agents going rogue and, setting the nukes off or whatever. And so I think the idea that safety, as it's defined, is so abstracted from questions of justice, including environmental justice, and is entirely really about technical tweaks and looking at models themselves and setting up guardrails and kind of using engineering to essentially ensure that the models don't kill us, while the models actually are actively killing us all through their contributions to climate change. And so I would just love to really do away with the AI safety conversations as they are currently construed and get rid of the X risk bullshit, essentially. Yeah.
So I have a practical one and I have a more radical philosophical one. My practical one is I'm a big fan of working open. I think working open is a transformative practice. Probably no surprise. I work for Mozilla after all. But I do think, especially the AI space, there's so many benefits in terms of transparency, in terms of mitigating bias that come from working in an open way. Working open is honestly really under threat in the AI space right now. And the irony is, if you look at the beginning of the development of AI, TensorFlow was open source. A lot of the Google research was open source. That was foundational stuff for AI. As there's been more and more competition in the space, more and more of this stuff has become closed. The CEO of OpenAI famously said that open source is a bad idea. They're kind of starting to vilify openness in the AI space. And Meta, ironically, is the one company that's kind of looking to distinguish themselves right now from working open and making everything open source. I don't expect that's going to last. I don't think we're going to see that be a long-term strategy for them. I think that's probably a temporary thing for them. So I'm thinking a lot about what are the things that we could be working on right now, what are the things we could be funding right now. There's still that kind of window of opportunity. The door still feels like it's open. What are ways that we can kind of support open technologies in this space that could have some viability in the long term so that we don't end up in this future where everything is closed? My more kind of radical thought here is somebody on the panel yesterday, I forget who it was, mentioned this idea that in the context of AI, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we always make the assumption that we're talking about human intelligence, right? That's just a baseline assumption in this space. What are some forms of non-human intelligence that exist on this planet that we could be leveraging, that we could be using, that we could be learning from? Are there forms of non-human intelligence that maybe could be more useful than artificial intelligence, especially when we think about the context of the environment? If I could kind of start the AI conversation all over again, I think that's a question that I would love to see be a part of that, because it feels like that's kind of been lost already.
Damien has a hand up. Final comment on this, and then I think we'll be moving into Q&A. But yeah, put the coda on it.
I just wanted to kind of follow on that and say, one of the main things that we've been seeing, especially recently, in this conversation between disability justice, crip studies, thinking about Sonar Taylor's disabled ecologies, but many people working in disability and technology are having that same kind of framing of the question of how do we think about who and what we are and what we assume when we think about the perspective of the human, when we think about the perspective of intelligence. And the idea that's been kind of at the core of a lot of work, myself and others, the past several years has been, even the concept of intelligence is itself kind of a eugenicist, ableist notion when you come right down to it, because it excludes necessarily from its framing. So opening up to non-human perspectives, opening up to non-human entanglements and assemblages is, I think, especially when we think about the world in which we live going to be absolutely crucial to thinking about what comes next and where we go from here.
I am so sad to have to move us off that thread of conversation. I've been thinking a lot about mushrooms. But I would love to pivot us to Q&A. So I'm going to ask one of our RAs, Siobhan, will be coming around with the microphone. We also have someone monitoring the chat, which I understand is visible to us today. So we're going to start with a couple questions in person, and then we'll check in on questions in the chat. But yeah, please.
One thing I would love to hear your take on is, I'm going to preface it with, I teach engineering ethics here at the UVA, and I have a session where students always pick a topic that it's ethically relevant topic. And sometimes if they pick things like genetic engineering, and they say that genetic engineering, could have the problem of bringing all the evil characteristics and aspects of eugenics, that came from the Nazi regime, and I have to tell them, well, actually, the Nazis actually copied the laws from Virginia laws, and that's like a big shift from them, right? But when I was starting in environmental justice, this is how I segue it. Malthusianism was a big issue, and one of the ways we responded to Malthusianism was through the IPAT equation. Right, which kind of rationalized. And the IPAT equation was this notion that, so you have impact, and then you have PAT. You have population, you have affluence, and you have technology. And technology used to be the rationalizing factor. I mean, technology used to be the thing that mitigated affluence. And it used to have this character of, if you have a lot of affluence, you can mitigate some of that by having better technology, and then technology will take care of. And so we've had, I guess since then, 25 years of social science, and social science, critical science of technology, that shows us that technology's fixes also have their problems. But what we're seeing right now with AI, I think is turning completely on its head this notion that technology would be the rationalizing function of consumption, right? Because it's the thing that's now driving, so now we're seeing, growth in energy demand on the scale of post-World War II, at least in Virginia. And so how do we talk back to the technology community and address this technology going off the rails of the fact that it used to be something that would rationalize human impact on the resource base, and I guess generating a community awareness that somewhere along the line we lost sight of that role of technology, and so technology has now ghosted, the whole IPAT equation, and it's doing its own, massively, consuming and driving off consumption and driving off irrationality around the resource base. And how do we make this a problem for the whole culture of tech and STEM to take stock of this, in your perspective?
For me, this would, unfortunately, for the person I'm talking to, be a wonderful opportunity to launch into a huge rant about Moore's Law, which I think both, like, tech contains multitudes, but like roughly we could say that there's people who are executives making business decisions, and there are engineers who are building things, and that those two categories disappear a whole other range of workers, but maybe these are the folks that you're most in contact with. For the executives, this cashes out in a crisis of fixed capital, right? Like, tech companies are now holding the energy bill of compute in ways that wasn't true of previous generations of ICT. And so they're making huge trillion-dollar bets on the fact that, like, somehow generative algorithms will be the cash cow that gets them past a non-zero interest rate business environment. And it's a huge gamble, and we will see if they succeed. Perhaps they would care to consider other alternatives that maybe have slightly fewer degrees of percentage returns for shareholder value, but are kind of a less existential bet for a company. for the engineers themselves, I think like we need to teach the fact that Moore's law has run down, and it's no longer the case that we're coasting on this kind of material free lunch of computation getting less energy costly and less expensive in a linear way over time. We're kind of in this crisis point where like the clutter of computation is building up at the same time that we are using exponentially more of it. And so it's gonna show up in our backyards, and it's, you know, getting dirtier faster than the engineers are making the code more clean. So I think those are really interesting conjunctures for like business strategy, for our cultural assumptions of the immateriality of computing, and like the actual work of working with code and data systems. Like there are these parallel crises that we should think about solving. And I want to bring students into those conversations rather than kind of launching them off the cliff.
I think it feels like a foregone conclusion in Silicon Valley that in 10 years' time, AI will be embedded in every single piece of technology we use, and it's going to be a part of our, like, every interaction with technology. And I am not actually sure if that's true. I don't know if I really believe that. I think if you look at the way that AI operates right now, there's a huge environmental cost, of course, to using it. It's also incredibly expensive. Like, it's in terms of the resources that you need for a single query, it doesn't make a ton of sense. And if you look at the problems that AI is solving, AI is not writing code, it's summarizing documents, right? Most of the problems right now that AI is able to solve well are problems that human beings are not paid all that much money to do. So if you look at the kind of economic equation, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I think there's a lot of VC money and a lot of big tech money that is pumping this stuff up and holding it up because there's so much hype. I think it's entirely possible that just based on the kind of economic grounds, AI will not necessarily fizzle out, but it won't be quite as widespread of a thing as we might think it would be, which I think honestly would kind of be for the best on a number of fronts. Because if you think about the tremendous environmental impact we're already seeing, if you imagine this technology being used 10 times more, 100 times more, it's pretty terrifying to think about.
If I might, I would also say when we think about the notion that AI in 10 years is going to be embedded in everything, we've been saying that for the past 50 years. Right, like the idea, like it's a recurrent thing. We have the paradigm of the AI summer and the AI winter for a reason. And the thing that pushes us towards, you know, moving into these techno-social paradigms over and over and over again. There are externalities that have to be addressed in a deeper way, and I think that question of like, what are the values of the people who are pushing toward it? What are the actual aims here? Because while we might think we're talking about the same things and the same kinds of needs to be met, we're very often talking past each other. And one group of people means one thing by what it is they're trying to achieve, and we mean something very totally different. And without a clear understanding of what it is they actually think of as good and as the good of this technology, without being made to confront that question in a very real, direct, and intentional way, we're just going to keep pushing in different directions, and whoever has the predominant power levers is going to win that conversation, unfortunately. And I think that's something that needs to change.
Just on like a very pragmatic level, when I was at Intel, one of my dreams was to show engineers what happens to technologies after they're no longer usable and they end up being refurbished. So, you know, I live in Oakland, California, going to Fruitvale and going to the Tech Exchange, where during the pandemic, particularly, a lot of Oakland school kids did not have access to laptops, and the supply chain was completely out of whack. And so turning to refurbished devices and understanding how decisions that Microsoft makes with Windows can have impacts on refurbishers and also on the people who used reusable devices. And so I think, you know, introducing the idea of like supply chain studies essentially to engineers and getting them to really think about how the work that they do, often on a very like intricate and small part of the bigger picture of technology. So instead of just thinking in like JIRA tickets, like how do you think about all of the different holistic connections across the supply chain? So that, yeah, that's like my fantasy that I've never gotten to realize, but I would love to take engineers on like a tour of the supply chain.
Hello, I'm Ahmed Darawi. I am a postdoc at the Karsh Institute. I have a general question. If you are in the position to choose between two different policy models, centralized versus decentralized AI policy models, which is the centralized AI, specifically AI policy model, more of the top-down model that's the state or policymakers in charge of establishing specific policies that regulates the use of AI, versus the decentralized model, which is more involve stakeholders, local individuals, to hear more from them about their expectations, their needs, issues related to the AI. Which one of these policy models would you choose, and what do you think the effects of your choice between these two policy models in terms of the fairness and the effectiveness, if we're talking about the AI and environmental justice context? Thank you.
I have an easy answer. So because I focus less on the content of compute and more on just the bulk of it, my answer is very easy. I think that we need a centralized model. I think it needs to be internationally effective, or again, there's going to be leakages, right? Compute is going to move to where it's cheap and unregulated. We see this even within like federalist nation states, like the United States, right? Like people are just crawling to plunk data centers down where there are deindustrialized communities that are desperate for big promises that often don't cash out. And so I think in terms of fairness, like the conversation we had yesterday around like cities and cultural policy, those are areas where I think it would make more sense for there to be, you know, more parochial, more customized, culturally responsive questions. But in terms of just like the number of dang computers on the earth, we got to tackle that from above.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on that one, particularly because, I mean, when we're talking about individual regulation on like a city by city or state by state or country by country basis, but we're dealing with companies that are by nature global, that I think creates a big gap between, you know, it doesn't really matter what California says or what like parts of Europe or Brazil says, if there isn't a comprehensive kind of global understanding and the need for standards. I think that's the other thing. We need to empower international standards bodies to be part of these conversations. And that I think will just lead to more fairness when it comes to thinking about how regulatory decisions play out. And yeah, looking at like Bitcoin mining, for example. So China bans it, and then like look at where it went in the States. You know, it's like Texas became a favorite location. And, you know, I think that having conversations kind of across not just disciplines, but also areas of tech is really important. Like when we're talking about AI, we're also really talking about energy infrastructures. We are talking about something that is much larger than, you know, a particular model.
Yeah, big plus one to all of that, especially the standards piece. I mean, I think that's something that I'm really interested in. You've got to look at, you know, what do these big tech companies actually respond to and what will actually change their behavior, right? So as much as I'm a fan of decentralization as a general concept, and as much as I think there is a role to be played here for the kind of like local bespoke solutions, some kind of central policy response I think will be necessary to get these companies to actually change their behavior. And yeah, it's hard to imagine it happening otherwise.
There's, in all of that, like everybody's responses here, there's this thread for me. I have a phrase that I kind of return to often in many different areas, contexts. Is it can always be both. It also often needs to be both. Like everything that you all have said so far is, you know, there has to be that space where the community can make some guidelines for what it is they need and can have input and talking about what it is they're going to be affected by. But there has to be a centralized response as well. There has to be some standard setting body. But I also then think that recursively to that, the standard setting body has to be responsive to the needs of the people who are going to be most likely outsizably harmed by these things if the if the regulations and standards go wrong, right? So there has to be a place for me wherein the decentralized response, the community-based response is recognized and accounted for by the centralized standard setting body and is actually, again, kind of meaningfully responsive to the needs of the community rather than just, yes, we have allowed you to say things and now those things are logged in a repository somewhere and we will make whatever rules we were going to make to begin with. Like that, I think that way of doing things doesn't actually make sure that people whose communities do end up being Bitcoin mining hubs or outsourced for various types of extractive data mining or the harmful placement of data centers, that they have the ability to meaningfully understand why it's happened to them and to push back against it happening. It has to be very carefully interconnected both.
All right. In the interest of fairness, I want to give an opportunity for the folks who are participating remotely to ask questions. So is there a way for us to see, or I'm going to give our RAs the prerogative here to select one of the questions that's been entered into the chat. Ying, are they visible to you? Okay, cool. Well, this is your opportunity. Throw a question in the chat. In the meantime, I promised a question to someone who didn't get to ask one yesterday. So, Siobhan, if we could get the microphone right over there.
Thank you very much. I have a couple questions directly related to creativity and environmental justice. Theoretically, I read a couple of weeks ago the first auction of a piece of artwork, painting, done by AI, robots, number one. And number two is a personal experience. I was buying something at Foods of All Nations with a gift card. And so this much total to be deducted from the total gift amount. So I was using my little brain, my pea brain, I got it. And then the cashier took the cell phone out, crunch it in and everything. And I have this horrible doomsday vision. I said, oh my God, one day we human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, will become the robot, and then AI will be the human being with the brain to control us. So my question is theoretically, and I'd just like to hear your words of wisdom. Where do you draw the line? Where is the finish line that we must not cross? Number one. Number two, because I'm not a tech person, I'm a social scientist by training. So number two, environmental justice. And I think the grandmaker gentleman earlier mentioned to the negative impacts on local residents in Texas. And I also read in Texas, they have in very rural area, they have factories, sites, I should say, to hold all these big machines to store all the data. Yeah, AI, but all the data needs to be stored someplace, and that's where they're being stored. And multitude of them, big machines, and then humming all the time, 24/7. And then in order to keep them cool, they have to have ventilation, fans, things like that, 24/7 as well. So all that shaking, earthquake, and all that humming in the atmosphere, in the noise, have definitely negatively impacted many local residents' health situation. So what quote unquote the authorities doing about these things? What could be done essentially, really? It's kind of like dependent, AI is dependent on these facilities, these fundamental facilities to enable it to keep going. What could be done? What are being done? And also, where's the finish line? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughtful questions. And I I will defer to you on the kind of data center and data infrastructure piece of that. I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. I think, when you think about some of these things, right, sometimes there are regulations in place and sometimes there are regulators and sometimes there are clear violations and the regulator requires some prodding to actually do their job or to actually follow up on something. So I'll talk about the methane context because that's something that I'm more familiar with and that's kind of on my mind at the moment. But, there are a lot of facilities that leak methane in various amounts in various facilities kind of all over. And it's a question of how much is it being monitored and how much is it being enforced. And the kind of monitoring that is available right now in terms of like physical monitoring on premises and things like that is like pretty crude and not very able to like well detect the emissions of methane. And so a lot of oil and gas companies use that as a loophole, right? They know that it's hard to measure, they know that it's hard to enforce, and so they will have all these leaks in the system and they don't really worry about it so much because there's other things that the regulator may be going after them for, so they don't worry about the methane so much. And so the project that we funded is a way to kind of close that gap a little bit and to say, actually, we have a way of measuring methane that is highly accurate. It's very easy. It doesn't require anything on the premises. We can just use publicly available satellite data. It's open source, so anybody can audit it. Anybody can ensure the kind of veracity of this data. And that's, you can hand basically all of that data to a regulator and say, this is verifiable data that these violations are happening at this scale every single day. And so I think to me, those are interventions that can help close some of that gap because you're right. I mean, there's absolutely a ton of environmental impacts that are either not being measured, they're not being regulated, or regulators are kind of looking the other way. And so, is there a way that technology can be a tool to help us kind of prod these regulators and to get them to kind of get up and take action in some of these cases?
The finish line. Don't cross that line. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, I have an answer to that.
Oh, sure.
So I think a lot of people relate to AI through the language of intelligence, right? And the anxieties and the concerns about, building a system that becomes more powerful than humans that then subjugates them or diminishes like human creativity. And I think those are really interesting thought experiments and really understandable anxieties. But with apologies to all the philosophers in the room, I think we can dodge them. We don't have to talk about them as questions of philosophy. We can talk about them as questions of politics, right? Because it's fundamentally, to me, a material question of how much compute do we need to build. And I think that politically, I would argue for a ceiling that prevents us from needing to worry about any of that nonsense. And that's a value judgment from my part on behalf of Silicon Valley, not on behalf of your anxieties, which again are very real and understandable. So I think we should just simply, make important human-centered decisions about environmental impacts that prevent us from needing to worry all that much about existential risks, per your point. And in terms of data center construction, so we need to really mobilize out in front of planned data centers, because once a data center is built, it tends to be expanded. We can build data centers that are better neighbors than the ones you're describing, that have soundproofing measures built in and acoustic studies. There should be policies that make that a standard obligation of any developer. The fact that there aren't represents the infancy, but also power of the industry. And I will just say, wherever there is a data center that is a huge problem, people are exploring ways of making that problem go away. You can simply cut off water to a data center to grind it to a halt, because as you point out, it needs a lot of water to cool off. So whether that is petitioning regulators to deny water permits to already existing data centers, as has been explored in Utah with the NSA's data centers, or maybe someone out there finds an exciting water pipe with a turn on it, turns it off and pours some concrete on it. I mean, these are ways that we could push back against a seeming inevitable techno-deterministic story. So,
If I could speak for philosophers for just a second about the question of where we draw a line. I try not to draw hard lines personally, because one of the things that I find happens when we draw hard lines in these kinds of questions, when we do think about intelligence and questions of personhood or questions of the diminishment of the human, we tend to find humans excluded on one side of that line. Very often what happens is by drawing that line, we forget that human capabilities are a range. There is no set fast human nature. there are relational capabilities and ways of being, and that's going to change constantly. So I think the question is, how do we make sure that we are intentional and careful about the changes that are happening in relation to these technologies? How do we make sure that we are thoughtful about what we're doing with them and why we are doing them, why we choose these paths, rather than simply letting regulators or, more to the point, the technology companies themselves determine what it is we can do with these and what we should be thinking as the right thing to do with these technologies and how that will change us. If we are careful about it, I think we can make paths forward that aren't just going to run over us.
Yeah, so I would just add to the points that we were making earlier on kind of the difficulties of measuring the human rights impacts associated with things like data centers or other parts of the AI infrastructure and supply chain. And I think that's why, I mean, we really need more researchers. We need more people who are trained in doing community engagement in a real way, and who are well aware of the ethics of also carrying out community related work, because like the nightmare would be if we just have a bunch of people who don't really know what they're doing, gathering, getting communities together around various data centers, and, not treating the communities as equal partners and not privileging the perspectives of the communities themselves, and kind of not making the community feedback actionable. So one of the problems too is like ensuring that the community insights around things like, noise pollution, air pollution, miscarriage, all of these health effects, that really are human rights issues, are brought to the attention of policymakers. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now with the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, it's part of the law school, we're working with law students to track all of the permitting around data centers that are either already in, under construction or are being, planned for construction, and looking at, where the environmental justice questions are really not part of the picture at all. And so having, basically having a bunch of lawyers and law students track these harms and, really coming up with a comprehensive way. And, in this case, having a framework that you can kind of start applying to each data center that is under construction is one potential thing. And then I think creating toolkits for communities to help them fight data centers in their backyard, or if they want a data center, what are the aspects that they need to be in place around the data center? What are their needs and what are their lines of refusal? So I think, this is all really going to be very difficult and important work, and I think having it supplemented by the more empirical sort of, capturing of methane or carbon emissions, water cost. I mean, I think you still need those metrics in order for regulators to really be able to do their job. The question just becomes like, how do you take all of the messier human impacts and make them actionable too?
Okay, thank you so much. That was awesome. Unfortunately, we need to wrap it up. And I saw some questions, extra questions over there. And I encourage you to speak to our speakers outside, ask your questions. And also, thank you so much again. I think we learned so much, and we leave this place with even more questions than answers. But these are very, very good questions. And we appreciate you coming all the way to UVA to share this, and our speakers yesterday as well. And all of you for being here. We are very grateful. And I want to say, if you want to follow up on this, like receive we are preparing a collection of essays based on all the conversations we had here these 2 days. Please sign up for the DTG Lab mailing list outside if you're not already, or just like keep an eye on our social media. Everything's going to be open access and like free to everyone to access. And please keep an eye out for our activities, I guess. Thank you so much. Thanks.